So we're going to look at lesson 3 this evening, and we're calling that David's reign. The next 3 lessons are very closely connected. David's reign, and then I think we've got Solomon's reign, and then Solomon builds the temple. So I'm not real concerned with just finishing lesson 3 this evening. They're kind of each bleed into each other. But we'll get started anyway this evening. And I've made an effort to go through the lesson sheets and go through all that material. And then there will be some supplemented material as we go through things that I hadn't prepared for in the sense of putting questions, et cetera, in the lesson sheet. But hopefully that'll not deter us. Okay, so we'll start out just noting that we're on lesson 3. We've talked about this promise that God makes to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. We may get to that this evening. Like I say, we'll just see what happens. But we're going to focus on that and on some other things related to it as we think about David's reign. So we've had this slide before where we have put these promises side by side. We add David's promise to that. And then we suggested that there are 3 main covenants or promises that God makes through Abraham, then Moses, then David. And we've seen the fulfillment in a very brief way of surveying the history. We've seen the fulfillment of that nation and land promise. But then, we're awaiting the fulfillment of all the families of the earth being blessed through Abraham's seed. And is that tied to the promise made to David? And if so, how is that a part of that? Okay, and I think we said last time that the odd one out here is this middle covenant that God makes with Moses, through Moses with Israel. And maybe part of the failure on Israel's part was to assume that all 3 of these were sort of unconditional, that you'll receive these blessings and these promises irregardless of what you do. But that middle one is not like that, is it? That covenant relationship with God and special status as a holy nation is conditioned upon their obedience. And of course, that's where they failed. And so maybe because they didn't take seriously this need for them to obey God. All right, so let's look at David's reign. And Saul goes to the house of Jesse. Samuel goes to the house of Jesse to anoint the next king, because we studied last time that Saul had been rejected as king. And noteworthy, I think, when he reaches that place is this manner in which the sons of Jesse are brought before him. And what's the statement made in verses 6 and 7 in chapter 16 there? Okay, so Samuel says in verse 6, surely the Lord's anointed is before him, this oldest son, Eliab. And God's response is, don't look on the appearance or the height. Almost the exact thing for which Saul was chosen, or at least that which was noteworthy about him. And so God tries to dissuade Samuel from thinking in those terms. He says, I have rejected him, not in the sense that he had rejected Saul, but that's not my choice. And then the statement that the Lord sees in a different way. He looks on the heart as opposed to the outward appearance. And I will say that, I don't know that we'll spend a lot of time on this, but when you compare Saul and David, and you say, okay, what's the difference between the two? There's a lot of discussion about what that difference is. It's a matter of the heart, but how are they distinguished from each other? Now, we saw some negatives as far as Saul last week, but we'll spend a little time just thinking about David this evening and maybe make some comparison and contrast there. But a lot of discussion about it. All right, so David is the youngest son. He's still out keeping the sheep. They call him in, and the Lord tells Samuel to anoint him, verse 12. And so Samuel obeys what God tells him to do. And so, at least in terms of the Lord's choice, David has been anointed as the next king. Okay? So I had all this here. I failed to. All right, so let's look at the second part of the lesson sheet there. David's response to Saul's threat, because what happens is David, because both of his exploits and his association with Saul, gets elevated to a certain position here. The start of that is chapter 17, which we won't really talk about, his defeat of Goliath, but that raises his profile among the Israelites, and they start paying attention to him. And so you can kind of trace in these latter chapters of 1 Samuel what happens between David and Saul. So here are the passages that I suggested that we look at. And what I've done is try to kind of map these out so you can sort of follow the action here as we go along. So here are the southern provinces. There's Judah to the south. And then, I don't know if you remember that we talked about Benjamin being here, Ephraim just above it, Jerusalem right there on the boundary between them. Dan goes up along the side here. And then you can see some of these places that are described as we go through. So the first thing that happens in chapter 15, after Samuel goes out and confronts Saul about his failure to obey God's command to destroy the Amalekites, we're told at the end of chapter 15 that Samuel goes up to Ramah and that Saul goes to Gibeah. That's the city from which he has come. So he's of the tribe of Benjamin. Okay? And so chapter 19, what happens there? And so we'll fill in the history here. Chapter 17, there's this battle between the Philistines and the Israelites, and David goes up to the battlefront and he takes on Goliath. He slays Goliath. So he comes back in chapter 18, and what are the people saying about him? What's the praise that David's receiving? Saul's killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And so it says that Saul begins to eye him. We noticed that last time. Okay? And I've added this Samuel going down to Bethlehem. We just discussed it there in chapter 16. He anoints David. And then somewhere in there, a little uncertain as to the details, Saul is described as restless and has this kind of evil spirit. And so someone knows about David, and they have him come up and play the lyre for Saul, and that seems to soothe his nerves a little bit. All right, and then we have chapter 17, the battle between David and Goliath. And then chapter 18, David's receiving all this praise. And so we pick up in chapter 19, actually chapter 18. I don't think I listed that one either. And what happens here? And this follows this praise that David's receiving. And so David's playing the lyre in Saul's presence, and what does Saul do? Takes a spear and hurls it at him, okay? So not what you would think. And David's reaction here is what? Yeah. Evades him twice, okay? And then you go on to chapter 19, and there's some things that intervene. Well, here is David again in Saul's presence, and notice almost the same thing happens. And so Saul hurls his spear at David. It says David fled and escaped that night. So now he's on the run. And it says he fled and escaped, chapter 19, verse 18. He came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. So I suppose he's a little bit frustrated. He's He knows he's in danger. And so he goes with Samuel, it says, to Ramah. First he goes back and he consults Jonathan, with whom he has made friends. We saw at the outset of chapter 18 that Jonathan and David become very close-knit. We suggested that, their dispositions seem to be the same. Jonathan is willing to go up and fight regardless of the odds. David seems to be of the same spirit. They form a close-knit friendship. And so in verse 1, it says, David fled from Naioth to Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father, that he seeks my life?" So he's asking Jonathan for help. What's going on here? And remember the kind of pact they make. Jonathan's going to go find out in Saul's presence, which he does. And when he returns back, David's out in the field and it's going to shoot some arrows. And if he tells the boy that's chasing the arrows that they're beyond him, then that means that David's in trouble. And that's exactly what happened. So at the end of the chapter, look at verse 42. It says, Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, because we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between you and me, and between my offspring and your offspring forever." And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So David's on the run at this point, isn't he? All right. He actually goes down to Ahimelech, chapter 21, and that's in this city of Nob there, not far away. And what is he looking for when he approaches Ahimelech? Do you remember what he asked him for? He wants a weapon, and he's given Goliath's sword, the very one that he cut off Goliath's head with, and he asked for food. And what's that incident where Ahimelech gives him food? Do you remember? What's the only food? It's the showbread that's in the tabernacle there. So he says, well, you can have that. And so he takes that and he leaves. And notice it says of Ahimelech, he came to meet David trembling and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" So Ahimelech suspects that something's up. Why is David coming to me? What does he want? Well, he tells him what he wants. But David ends up fleeing at this point, and he goes out where? He goes to the Philistines. He goes to the other side. And what does he do there in the presence of Achish? That's kind of interesting. He feigns what? Yeah. Kind of a madness. I suppose the object is to give the impression that he's not of danger to them, even though he's renowned as the one who's gone out and slain all these Philistines. Okay, yeah. And so, that's one of these episodes where you think, okay, that seems kind of odd for David to act in this way. He leaves there. In chapter 22, he comes to the cave of Adullam. He departs, escapes to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And then notice the second verse, everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. So it's all kind of like all the misfits in Judah are going to gather around David here in this cave where he's holed up. And it says he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. So now David becomes David and his men. So what's he up to? Well, the next step, chapter 23, what happens with Keilah? Verse 1. Okay, yeah, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah. And notice what David does, which is unlike what Saul did. Maybe one of the differences we can make. He's constantly asking, inquiring of God, what should I do? Should I go up and attack the Philistines? God says yes, and so he does that. And so the result is that he saves the inhabitants of Keilah. All right. Well, chapter 23, Saul hears about this. He finds out from the inhabitants of Keilah that David is there, and so he goes after David. He takes his men, and they go down there, and it says David now has about 600 men. They depart from Keilah and went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. So what's the pattern that you're seeing in all of this? Here's Saul and David. Saul seems to be after David. What's David's reaction? Okay, he's avoiding Saul. He's not attacking Saul. He's not going on the offensive. He's escaping when he can. He's trying to find some way out. And he continues to do that. Okay? So a couple of more instances. David goes over here to En-Gedi, and what happens there in chapter 24? There are a couple of instances here in chapter 24 and 26 that are kind of interesting. What opportunity is David given in each of these instances, occasions? Yeah. So first in the cave there at En-Gedi, Saul is there before him. His men encourage David to take his life. Saul's come down there with his men. Look at this, 3,000 chosen men in order to pursue David. But David's response, verse 6, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord. And so David persuades his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up, left the cave, went on his way. So he lets him escape. And then before chapter 26, there is this incident in chapter 25. I didn't have that on the sheet, but David and his men are around this area in the Judean wilderness there to the south, and it sounds like they've kind of played policeman as far as taking care of the flocks that are around there. And so they approach Nabal, who has a lot of flocks, who has a lot of sheep, and they say, hey, do you have anything to give us? I think sort of in return for what we've done for you. And Nabal kind of threatens David and his men. And what's David's reaction to that? I know you didn't have that assigned, but chapter 25, what's his reaction that causes Abigail, his wife, to kind of insert herself in things? Okay, yeah. Okay, so denies, then offends. And what's David ready to do? Go wipe him out. Now that's interesting because is David the kind of person that just is, just a little bit of cowardice that's being displayed? Not at all. And so he is only swayed from doing what he could have done, attacking Nabal, by his wife Abigail. And of course Nabal then dies. David takes Abigail for his wife. But that's an interesting event that takes place between these other two because it demonstrates, among other things, what David could have easily done with Saul. And he refuses to do that. All right, so then chapter 26, there is this next occasion, the Ziphites. It seems like these people are always telling on David. Well, he's down here among us. And so here comes Saul again. He's ready to attack. He arises, goes down to this wilderness with his men, seeking David. This time David and I think it's Abishai sneak down into the camp. They take his spear, they take Saul's water bottle, and then they go stand off in the distance and call to him. And I don't think I've got it here, but what's David's plea to Saul? It's just beyond where I was. Let me find that. 1 Samuel 26. Yeah, they're kind of shouting at each other. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah, so verse 18. Why does my Lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands? Now therefore let my Lord the king hear the words of his servant. And then he says some other things. He says, verse 20, now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains. And Saul's response, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will do no more do you harm. So Saul is always ready to change, seems to be willing to repent, but really never quite gets there, does he? Okay? So what's the conclusion from all of that? What would you say about David and what he has displayed in all these instances where Saul has confronted him? What's that? Yeah, he's patient. Okay. He's not going to retaliate, Michael? Yeah. Okay. Great point. So, yeah, he's not attacking Saul, but he's not attacking Saul because Saul has been chosen by God and he was his king, and so he's not going to threaten that. Ian? Okay. 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 All right. Very good. So, yeah, a lot of things that stand out. David doesn't retaliate, and he doesn't take it into his hands to strike against the Lord's anointed. And he had occasions to do so, didn't he? All right. We're off the page there, but demonstrated too by chapter 31 when Saul and his sons finally go into battle against the Philistines and they're defeated, they're killed. What's David's reaction when word reaches him? 2 Samuel chapter 1. Yeah, he's distraught. He sings this psalm of lamentation for David, for Saul and for Jonathan. And so, again, he's not going to take action against them. He has shown honor and set apart God's choices in having chosen Saul as king. And he's upset about what takes place. Yeah. Yeah. And again, so punishing that indicates that he's very willing to take action if necessary. But he didn't do it against Saul, but he does it on this occasion. Okay? So they die in battle. The battle takes place up to the north there, around Mount Gilboa. I think I've got another map here that shows that. So Saul comes up from the south. He fights against the Philistines. They're driven to Mount Gilboa. And so they're defeated on the battlefield. The Philistines take his body and put it on the walls at Bethshan. And it's the men of Jabesh Gilead that come from across the Jordan and remove the body and take it back. And that was the scene of Saul's first victory when he helped defeat the Ammonites there in Jabesh Gilead. All right. Let's think about David's reign as king, just some notes about what takes place there. How long does he reign over the house of Judah? Yeah, 7.5 years. Okay. Chapter 2 and verse 11, we're told how he was king in Hebron over the house of Judah for 7 years and 6 months. So here's a map showing the division there. There's David and Judah to the south. And then Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, is still reigning as king over the rest of Israel in the north. And so in chapter 4, what happens? 2 Samuel chapter 4. Yeah, a couple of men thinking that they're going to show David how much they admire him and how loyal they are. They kill Ishbosheth and they bring his head to David. And David does to them what he had done to the Amalekite that reported Saul's death on the battlefield. So David is not out for revenge. It's very clear in terms of his actions. And so we're told in chapter 5 that he reigns for a total of how many years? 40 years, 7.5 at Hebron, and then the other 33 over all of Israel. And so that map changes from just ruling over the southern portion of Judah there to the entire kingdom. And you kind of look at that darker area in the middle is what he had been reigning over. During his reign, he expands the borders of the kingdom. And I think I said last week, almost to the territory that God had promised to Israel at the outset. So David's very successful as a king and successful in the areas that he controls. All right, a couple of other incidents here before we go on. He defeats the Jebusites and takes Jerusalem, 2 Samuel chapter 5, 6 to 10. What's the significance, if any, of that, besides he defeated this city? Okay. There's brief mention made at the start of Judges that they took the city, but it doesn't seem like they held it. So now David, all this time later, takes the city of Jerusalem. Well, why is that important in the story? Or is it? All right, his city. Okay, so that's the place where the temple will be constructed, and it is a very significant place, and it's really right in the middle of the land, isn't it? It's at a high elevation, probably strategically helpful, but it's a very important place, and David makes it so. In addition to which, he moves the ark to Jerusalem, 2 Samuel 6. So really, chapter 5, taking Jerusalem, paves the way for bringing the ark to Jerusalem. Where has the ark been? I didn't ask you about this, so you get extra points for knowing the answer to this one. Remember in the first part of 1 Samuel, when Samuel begins as judge, you remember what the Israelites did on one occasion, Eli's sons, when they were in battle with the Philistines? What did they take out with them to the battle? They took the ark. Why? Yeah, they thought this would achieve a victory for them, didn't they? Yeah, almost as a weapon. It's almost as if they had more regard for this little box and what it stood for than they did for God himself. And so the Philistines defeated them, captured the ark, but what happened after that? You remember the story? How long did they keep it? Well, I shouldn't have asked how long. I don't know how long it was, but not long, because they had problems as a result of having it in their hands, and they finally said, you can have it back. Remember, they put it on an ox cart and they sent it toward Israel, and it ended up in Beth Shemesh, and those people apparently had a little curiosity about it, so they looked inside it, and they had problems. And so it was taken to a place called Kiriath Jearim, not far from Jerusalem, and that's where it has stayed for all of this time. So think of that. The tabernacle, the tent, still seems to be up there in Shiloh, but the ark has been captured by the Philistines and then ultimately returned. But Saul hadn't done a thing with it. It was just where it had been left. And now David is concerned enough to first capture Jerusalem and then to go get the ark and have it transported to Jerusalem. And I think that's significant. Okay. So that's the end of section B there. We'll come back to this in a moment. 2 Samuel chapter 7, talk about the promises to David. Let's go to the end of David's reign. And you can see here we're not spending a lot of time about that, but I just ask, was David a perfect man? Perfect king? Not at all. So in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, his sin with Bathsheba, Nathan confronts him about it. But what does David do when he's confronted? Yeah, he repents. Is his repentance sincere? It is. And we could talk about that. We won't right now. But, he seems grief-stricken when he realizes, all the implications of what he's done. Are there consequences to his action? Yeah, how long do those last? The rest of his reign in his household. And that's exactly what God predicts for him, and that's what plays out. So it isn't that David's a sinless man, but we've seen some characteristics of him that differ from Saul. He asks God what he should do. He gives God the glory when he does something. He won't attack God's anointed. He repents of his sin and is sincere in doing that. Other thoughts about the difference between the two? Yeah, please, Derek. Okay. Comes right back to 1 Samuel 16. Okay. Okay, very good. Okay, so that's just kind of skimming over the surface there. But that says something about the character of both of these men, and I think is very accurate. Okay, we got a few minutes left, and this is kind of what I figured would happen. We won't get to 2 Samuel 7, but we're going to get there next week by comparing 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. So let's take a bird's eye view of these two accounts of history. And last week, you might remember at the very end I said, why is it that 1 Chronicles only devotes one chapter to the reign of Saul? We just spent about 25 chapters, didn't feel like that, but 25 chapters in 1 Samuel talking about Saul's reign. One chapter in 1 Chronicles. Now, why the difference? Let's try and answer that question. So, last time we said, if you look at 1 Samuel, if you can kind of keep these in mind, you've got Samuel as judge for the first quarter of the book, Saul anointed as king, Samuel anointing him. We're told about his exploits up until chapter 15, where he fails to destroy the Amalekites. And then after David is anointed in chapter 16, the rest of the book is about this Saul-David problem that arises because of Saul. So, that's one way to think of the book. A quarter of it has to do with Samuel, a quarter of it has to do with Saul, the last half has to do with Saul and David. 2 Samuel is about the reign of David. So let's think about David's reign. And again, we're just summarizing here, but notice, first 5 chapters, David is consolidating his kingdom. We just read in chapter 5 that he reigns for 7 years in Hebron over Judah, and then finally over the entire nation for the last 33 years. He brought the ark to Jerusalem. God makes this promise that we're going to look at. Chapters 8 to 10 tell us about his conquest as king, and he was very victorious as a king. A lot of battles he fought, not only the Philistines, but other nations around him, expands the borders. The sin with Bathsheba, chapters 11 and 12, all the fallout from that, which really continues through the rest of his reign. And then at the very end of 2 Samuel, there's what's thought of as kind of an appendix, some narrative about David and some situations he faced. All right, that's 1 and 2 Samuel. So let's compare that with 1 Chronicles. First 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles are genealogies. Now, if you thought it was difficult reading through Matthew chapter 1, try these 9 chapters. And what's interesting is, repeatedly, there is this term used of all Israel. So, different genealogies, but it really starts with Adam and it goes all the way through until the exile. So, we might just chalk that up and say, well, they're establishing their bloodlines, which certainly that enabled them to do. But let's look a little further. As I said last time, Saul's death is recorded in chapter 10, but that's all that we really read about Saul. His genealogy is actually mentioned a couple of times, earlier in chapter 8, I think, and then again at the end of chapter 9. But look at this, David's reign, chapters 11 to 29. His anointing, the mighty men that he fights with, and then similarly, the ark being moved to Jerusalem. His family is described in chapter 14, and then chapters 18 to 20, the battles that he fights, and then the census that he takes, for which God punishes him. We haven't really talked about that. But look at the last 8 chapters, 21 to 29. What does it have to do with? Yeah. Now that's a lot of chapters for saying he's getting ready to help his son build the temple. But I think that's a key to maybe one of the differences between the two accounts here. They're both inspired history, they're both important, but the emphasis is different. So compare the two and notice what you get. As I say, in 1 and 2 Samuel, you have a lot of detail about Saul, very little in 1 Chronicles. And then when you compare them in terms of what David does, you do have some similarities. The ark being moved to Jerusalem, the promises made to David, the battles that David fights, and the census that he takes, the men that he fought with. Okay, those are similarities, but look at the differences. In 2 Samuel, you have a lot of detail about some of David's failures. You don't have those things described in 1 Chronicles. In fact, 1 Chronicles doesn't mention his sin with Bathsheba. Does that seem a little bit odd? 2 chapters in 1 and 2 Samuel, or 2 Samuel. So, what's the point? Is there a point? All right. What's that? Different focus. So let's find out what the focus is. All right, so on the left, 2 Samuel, David's reign, some of his failures. On the right, 1 Chronicles, David's attention given to the temple and to the ark and to those things related to it. So, why the difference? Well, think about the original readers of these accounts. Who were these accounts written for? We certainly benefit from them. But who was first going to consume this history? Starts with an I, yeah, or J. Jews or Israelites. Well, guess what? 1 and 2 Samuel were probably written at a time, oops, not that, okay, when the people had gone into captivity, and this is helping explain why they had gone into captivity. All right? And so you can understand some of the attention given to failures, to judgments that God brings upon them. 1 Chronicles in the Hebrew Bible is the very last book of the Hebrew Bible. It's not divided in two, there's just one. And so it presumably is the last book written, and guess when it was written? At least after some of the captives had returned. And the writer there, the Holy Spirit through the writer, seems to be emphasizing that despite the failures, God is faithful and God is going to bring about His promises. And what's key among those promises? That Israel is going to have a king. According to 2 Samuel chapter 7, or 1 Chronicles 17, that's the other passage in Chronicles. Now, what's true at the time that the captives return from exile? Where is their king? There is no king. And so what question might those captives, those returned captives be asking about their king, about the promise made to David? Is God going to keep His promise? And so I think part of the emphasis, at least, in the Chronicle account is to show that God is going to provide for His people according to the promises that He's made. And so we're going to look next time at the rest of David's reign from the standpoint of the Chronicles and the attention given to both the temple that David helps Solomon build and the ark that is a part of that temple. And see the attention that is given by God's chosen one to building this temple and to preserving all that's a part of it. Okay. So next time in the lesson there, we've got the section letter C about 2 Samuel chapter 7. Look at that. Compare it with 1 Chronicles 17. Very similar in some respects, but we'll notice all the elements of that promise that was made to David, and then we'll get into Solomon's reign and consider what Solomon did as David's son and how he helps to fulfill that promise.